Chapter 1. At 6 minutes past midnight, Tuesday morning, on the way home from a late rehearsal of her new stage show, Tina Evans saw her son, Danny, in a stranger's car. But Danny had been dead more than a year. 2 blocks from her house, intending to buy a quart of milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread, Tina stopped at a 24-hour market and parked in the dry yellow drizzle of a sodium vapor light, beside a gleaming, cream-colored Chevrolet station wagon. The boy was in the front passenger seat of the wagon, waiting for someone in the store. Tina could see only the side of his face, but she gasped in painful recognition. Danny. The boy was about 12, Danny's age. He had thick dark hair like Danny's, a nose that resembled Danny's, and a rather delicate jawline like Danny's too. She whispered her son's name, as if she would frighten off this beloved apparition if she spoke any louder. Unaware that she was staring at him, the boy put one hand to his mouth and bit gently on his bent thumb knuckle, which Danny had begun to do a year or so before he died. Without success, Tina had tried to break him of that bad habit. Now, as she watched this boy, his resemblance to Danny seemed to be more than mere coincidence. Suddenly Tina's mouth went dry and sour, and her heart thudded. She still had not adjusted to the loss of her only child, because she'd never wanted, or tried, to adjust to it. Seizing on this boy's resemblance to her Danny, she was too easily able to fantasize that there had been no loss in the first place. Maybe this boy actually was Danny. Why not? The more that she considered it, the less crazy it seemed. After all, she'd never seen Danny's corpse. The police and the morticians had advised her that Danny was so badly torn up, so horribly mangled, that she was better off not looking at him. Sickened, grief-stricken, she had taken their advice, and Danny's funeral had been a closed coffin service. But perhaps they had been mistaken when they identified the body. Maybe Danny hadn't been killed in the accident, after all. Maybe he'd only suffered a mild head injury, just severe enough to give him amnesia. Yes. Amnesia. Perhaps he had wandered away from the wrecked bus and had been found miles from the scene of the accident, without identification, unable to tell anyone who he was or where he came from. That was possible, wasn't it? She had seen similar stories in the movies. Sure. Amnesia. And if that were the case, then he might have ended up in a foster home, in a new life. And now here he was sitting in the cream-colored Chevrolet wagon, brought to her by fate, and by the boy became conscious of her gaze and turned toward her. She held her breath as his face came slowly around. As they stared at each other through 2 windows and through the strange sulphurous light, she had the feeling that they were making contact across an immense gulf of space and time and destiny. But then, inevitably, her fantasy burst, for he wasn't Danny. Pulling her gaze away from his, she studied her hands, which were gripping the steering wheel so fiercely that they ached. Damn! She was angry with herself. She thought of herself as a tough, competent, level-headed woman who was able to deal with anything life threw at her, and she was disturbed by her continuing inability to accept Danny's death. After the initial shock, after the funeral, she had begun to cope with the trauma. Gradually, day by day, week by week, she had put Danny behind her, with sorrow, with guilt, with tears and much bitterness, but also with firmness and determination. She had taken several steps up in her career during the past year, and she had relied on hard work as a sort of morphine, using it to dull her pain until the wound fully healed. But then, a few weeks ago, she had begun to slip back into the dreadful condition in which she'd wallowed immediately after she'd received news of the accident. Her denial was as resolute as it was irrational. Again, she was possessed by the haunting feeling that her child was alive. Time should have put even more distance between her and the anguish, but instead the passing days were bringing her round full circle in her grief. This boy in the station wagon was not the first that she had imagined was Danny. In recent weeks, she had seen her lost son in other cars, in schoolyards past which she had been driving, on public streets, in a movie theater. Also, she'd recently been plagued by a repeating dream in which Danny was alive. Each time, for a few hours after she woke, she could not face reality. She half convinced herself that the dream was a premonition of Danny's eventual return to her, that somehow he had survived and would be coming back into her arms one day soon. This was a warm and wonderful fantasy, but she could not sustain it for long. Though she always resisted the grim truth, it gradually exerted itself every time, and she was repeatedly brought down hard, forced to accept that the dream was not a premonition. Nevertheless, she knew that when she had the dream again, she would find new hope in it as she had so many times before. And that was not good. Sick, she berated herself. She glanced at the station wagon and saw that the boy was still staring at her. She glared at her tightly clenched hands again and found the strength to break her grip on the steering wheel. Grief could drive a person crazy. She'd heard that said, and she believed it. But she wasn't going to allow such a thing to happen to her. She would be sufficiently tough on herself to stay in touch with reality, as unpleasant as reality might be. She couldn't allow herself to hope. She had loved Danny with all her heart, but he was gone. Torn and crushed in a bus accident with 14 other little boys, just one victim of a larger tragedy. battered beyond recognition. Dead. Cold. Decaying. In a coffin. Under the ground. Forever. Her lower lip trembled. She wanted to cry, needed to cry, but she didn't. The boy in the Chevy had lost interest in her. He was staring at the front of the grocery store again, waiting. Tina got out of her Honda. The night was pleasantly cool and desert dry. She took a deep breath and went into the market, where the air was so cold that it pierced her bones, and where the harsh fluorescent lighting was too bright and too bleak to encourage fantasies. She bought a quart of non-fat milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread that was cut thin for dieters, so each serving contained only half the calories of an ordinary slice of bread. She wasn't a dancer anymore. Now she worked behind the curtain, in the production end of the show, but she still felt physically and psychologically best when she weighed no more than she had weighed when she'd been a performer. 5 minutes later, she was home. Hers was a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood. The olive trees and lacy melaleucas stirred lazily in a faint Mojave breeze. In the kitchen, she toasted 2 pieces of bread. She spread a thin skin of peanut butter on them, poured a glass of non-fat milk, and sat at the table. Peanut butter toast had been one of Danny's favorite foods, even when he was a toddler and was especially picky about what he would eat. When he was very young, he had called it Neenut butter. Closing her eyes now, chewing the toast, Tina could still see him, 3 years old, peanut butter smeared all over his lips and chin, as he grinned and said, "More Neenut butter toast, please." She opened her eyes with a start because her mental image of him was too vivid, less like a memory than like a vision. Right now, she didn't want to remember so clearly. But it was too late. Her heart knotted in her chest, and her lower lip began to quiver again, and she put her head down on the table. She wept. That night Tina dreamed that Danny was alive again. Somehow. Somewhere. Alive. And he needed her. In the dream, Danny was standing at the edge of a bottomless gorge, and Tina was on the far side, opposite him, looking across the immense gulf. Danny was calling her name. He was lonely and afraid. She was miserable because she couldn't think of a way to reach him. Meanwhile, the sky grew darker by the second. Massive storm clouds, like the clenched fists of celestial giants, squeezed the last light out of the day. Danny's cries and her response became increasingly shrill and desperate, for they knew that they must reach each other before nightfall or be lost forever. In the oncoming night, something waited for Danny, something fearsome that would seize him if he was alone after dark. Suddenly the sky was shattered by a lightning, then by a hard clap of thunder, and the night imploded into a deeper darkness, into infinite and perfect blackness. Tina Evans sat straight up in bed, certain that she had heard a noise in the house. It hadn't been merely the thunder from the dream. The sound she'd heard had come as she was waking, a real noise, not an imagined one. She listened intently, prepared to throw off the covers and slip out of bed. Silence reigned. Gradually doubt crept over her. She had been jumpy lately. This wasn't the first night she'd been wrongly convinced that an intruder was prowling the house. On 4 or 5 occasions during the past 2 weeks, she had taken the pistol from the nightstand and searched the place, room by room, but she hadn't found anyone. Recently she'd been under a lot of pressure, both personally and professionally. Maybe what she'd heard tonight had been the thunder from the dream. She remained on guard for a few minutes, but the night was so peaceful that at last she had to admit she was alone. As her heartbeat slowed, she eased back onto her pillow. At times like this, she wished that she and Michael were still together. She closed her eyes and imagined herself lying beside him, reaching for him in the dark, touching, moving against him, into the shelter of his arms. He would comfort and reassure her, and in time, she would sleep again. Of course, if she and Michael were in bed right this minute, it wouldn't be like that at all. They wouldn't make love. They would argue. He'd resist her affection, turn her away by picking a fight. He would begin the battle over a triviality and goad her until the bickering escalated into marital warfare. That was how it had been during the last months of their life together. He had been seething with hostility, always seeking an excuse to vent his anger on her. Because Tina had loved Michael to the end, she'd been hurt and saddened by the dissolution of their relationship. Admittedly, she had also been relieved when it was finally over. She had lost her child and her husband in the same year, the man first, and then the boy, the son to the grave and the husband to the winds of change. During the 12 years of their marriage, Tina had become a different and more complex person than she'd been on their wedding day. But Michael hadn't changed at all, and didn't like the woman that she had become. They began as lovers, sharing every detail of their daily lives, triumphs and failures, joys and frustrations, but by the time the divorce was final, they were strangers. Although Michael was still living in town, less than a mile from her, he was, in some respects, as far away and as unreachable as Danny. She sighed with resignation and opened her eyes. She wasn't sleepy now, but she knew she had to get more rest. She would need to be fresh and alert in the morning. Tomorrow was one of the most important days of her life, December 30th. In other years that date had meant nothing special. But for better or worse, This December 30th was the hinge, upon which her entire future would swing. For 15 years, ever since she turned 18, 2 years before she married Michael, Tina Evans had lived and worked in Las Vegas. She began her career as a dancer, not a showgirl but an actual dancer, in the Lido de Paris, a gigantic stage show at the Stardust Hotel. The Lido was one of those incredibly lavish productions that could be seen nowhere in the world but Vegas, for it was only in Las Vegas that a multi-million-dollar show could be staged year after year with little concern for profit. Such vast sums were spent on the elaborate sets and costumes, and on the enormous cast and crew, that the hotel was usually happy if the production merely broke even from ticket and drink sales. After all, as fantastic as it was, the show was only a come-on, a draw, with the sole purpose of putting a few thousand people into the hotel every night. Going to and from the showroom, the crowd had to pass all the craps tables and blackjack tables and roulette wheels and glittering ranks of slot machines, and that was where the profit was made. Tina enjoyed dancing in the Lido, and she stayed there for 2.5 years, until she learned that she was pregnant. She took time off to carry and give birth to Danny, then to spend uninterrupted days with him during his first few months of life. When Danny was 6 months old, Tina went into training to get back in shape, and after 3 arduous months of exercise, she won a place in the chorus line of a new Vegas spectacle. She managed to be both a fine dancer and a good mother, although that was not always easy. She loved Danny, and she enjoyed her work and she thrived on double duty. 5 years ago, however, on her 28th birthday, she began to realize that she had, if she was lucky, 10 years left as a show dancer, and she decided to establish herself in the business in another capacity, to avoid being washed up at 38. She landed a position as choreographer for a 2-bit lounge revue, a dismally cheap imitation of the multi-million-dollar Lido, and eventually she took over the costumer's job as well. From that, she moved up through a series of similar positions in larger lounges, then in small showrooms that seated 400 or 500 in second-rate hotels with limited show budgets. In time, she directed a revue, then directed and produced another. She was steadily becoming a respected name in the closely knit Vegas entertainment world, and she believed that she was on the verge of great success. Almost a year ago, shortly after Danny had died, Tina had been offered a directing and co-producing job on a huge $10 million extravaganza to be staged in the 2,000-seat main showroom of the Golden Pyramid, one of the largest and plushest hotels on the Strip. At first, it had seemed terribly wrong that such a wonderful opportunity should come her way before she'd even had time to mourn her boy, as if the fates were so shallow and insensitive as to think that they could balance the scales and offset Danny's death merely by presenting her with a chance at her dream job. Although she was bitter and depressed, although, or maybe because she felt utterly empty and useless, she took the job. The new show was titled Magic. Because the variety acts between the big dance numbers were all magicians, and because the production numbers themselves featured elaborate special effects and were built around supernatural themes. The tricky spelling of the title was not Tina's idea, but most of the rest of the program was her creation, and she remained pleased with what she had wrought. Exhausted too. This year had passed in a blur of 12 and 14-hour days, with no vacations and rarely a weekend off. Nevertheless, even as preoccupied with magic as she was, she had adjusted to Danny's death only with great difficulty. A month ago, for the first time, she'd thought that at last she had begun to overcome her grief. She was able to think about the boy without crying, to visit his grave without being overcome by grief. All things considered, she felt reasonably good, even cheerful to a degree. She would never forget him, that sweet child who had been such a large part of her, but she would no longer have to live her life around the gaping hole that he had left in it. The wound was achingly tender but healed. That's what she had thought a month ago. For a week or two, she had continued to make progress toward acceptance. Then the new dreams began, and they were far worse than the dream that she'd had immediately after Danny had been killed. Perhaps her anxiety about the public's reaction to magic was causing her to recall the greater anxiety she had felt about Danny. In less than 17 hours, at 8 p.m., December 30th, the Golden Pyramid Hotel would present a special, invitational, VIP premiere of Magic. And the following night, New Year's Eve, the show would open to the general public. If audience reaction was as strong and as positive as Tina hoped, her financial future was assured, for her contract gave her 2.5% of the gross receipts, minus liquor sales, after the first $5 million. If Magic was a hit and packed the showroom for 4 or 5 years, as sometimes happened with successful Vegas shows, she'd be a multimillionaire by the end of the run. Of course, if the production was a flop, if it failed to please the audience, she might be back working the small lounges again, on her way down. Show business, in any form, was a merciless enterprise. She had good reason to be suffering from anxiety attacks. Her obsessive fear of intruders in the house, her disquieting dreams about Danny, her renewed grief, all of those things might grow from her concern about Magic. If that were the case, then those symptoms would disappear as soon as the fate of the show was evident. She needed only to ride out the next few days, and in the relative calm that would follow, she might be able to get on with healing herself. In the meantime, she absolutely had to get some sleep. At 10 o'clock in the morning, She was scheduled to meet with 2 tour booking agents who were considering reserving 8,000 tickets to Magic during the first 3 months of its run. Then at 1 o'clock, the entire cast and the crew would assemble for the final dress rehearsal. She fluffed her pillows, rearranged the covers, and tugged at the short nightgown in which she slept. She tried to relax by closing her eyes and envisioning a gentle night tide lapping at a silvery beach. Thump. She sat straight up in bed. Something had fallen over in another part of the house. It must have been a large object because, though muffled by the intervening walls, the sound was loud enough to rouse her. Whatever it had been, it hadn't simply fallen. It had been knocked over. Heavy objects didn't just fall of their own accord in deserted rooms. She cocked her head, listening closely. Another and softer sound followed the first. It didn't last long enough for Tina to identify the source, but there was a stealthiness about it. This time she hadn't been imagining a threat. Someone actually was in the house. As she sat up in bed, she switched on the lamp. She pulled open the nightstand drawer. The pistol was loaded. She flicked off the 2 safety catches. For a while, she listened. In the brittle silence of the desert night, she imagined that she could sense an intruder listening for her. She got out of bed and stepped into her slippers. Holding the gun in her right hand, she went quietly to the bedroom door. She considered calling the police, but she was afraid of making a fool of herself. What if they came, lights flashing and sirens screaming, and found no one? If she had summoned the police every time that she imagined hearing a prowler in the house during the past 2 weeks, they would have decided long ago that she was scramble-brained. She was proud, unable to bear the thought of appearing to be hysterical to a couple of macho cops who would grin at her and, later over donuts and coffee, make jokes about her. She would search the house herself, alone. Pointing the pistol at the ceiling, she jacked a bullet into the chamber. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the bedroom door and eased into the hall. Chapter 2. Tina searched the entire house, except for Danny's old room, but she didn't find an intruder. She almost would have preferred to discover someone lurking in the kitchen or crouching in a closet rather than be forced to look, at last, in that final space where sadness seemed to dwell like a tenant. Now she had no choice. A little more than a year before he had died, Danny had begun sleeping at the opposite end of the small house from the master bedroom, in what had once been the den. Not long after his 10th birthday, the boy had asked for more space and privacy than was provided by his original, tiny quarters. Michael and Tina had helped him move his belongings to the den, then had shifted the couch, armchair, coffee table, and television from the den into the quarters the boy had previously occupied. At the time, Tina was certain that Danny was aware of the nightly arguments she and Michael were having in their own bedroom, which was next to his, and that he wanted to move into the den so he wouldn't be able to hear them bickering. She and Michael hadn't yet begun to raise their voices to each other. Their disagreements had been conducted in normal tones, sometimes even in whispers, yet Danny probably had heard enough to know they were having problems. She had been sorry that he'd had to know, but she hadn't said a word to him. She'd offered no explanations, no reassurances. For one thing, she hadn't known what she could say. She certainly couldn't share with him her appraisal of the situation. "Danny, sweetheart, don't worry about anything you might have heard through the wall. Your father is only suffering an identity crisis. He's been acting like an ass lately, but he'll get over it." And that was another reason she didn't attempt to explain her and Michael's problems to Danny. She thought that their estrangement was only temporary. She loved her husband, and she was sure that the sheer power of her love would restore the luster to their marriage. 6 months later she and Michael separated, and less than 5 months after the separation, they were divorced. Now, anxious to complete her search for the burglar, who was beginning to look as imaginary as all the other burglars she had stalked on other nights, she opened the door to Danny's bedroom. She switched on the lights and stepped inside. No one. Holding the pistol in front of her, she approached the closet, hesitated, then slid the door back. No one was hiding there, either. In spite of what she had heard, she was alone in the house. As she stared at the contents of the musky closet, the boy's shoes, his jeans, dress slacks, shirts, sweaters, his blue Dodgers baseball cap, the small blue suit he had worn on special occasions, a lump rose in her throat. She quickly slid the door shut and put her back against it. Although the funeral had been more than a year ago, she had not yet been able to dispose of Danny's belongings. Somehow, the act of giving away his clothes would be even sadder and more final than watching his casket being lowered into the ground. His clothes weren't the only things that she had kept. His entire room was exactly as he had left it. The bed was properly made, and several science fiction movie action figures were posed on the deep headboard. More than 100 paperbacks were ranked alphabetically on a 5-shelf bookcase. His desk occupied one corner. Tubes of glue, miniature bottles of enamel in every color, and a variety of model crafting tools stood in soldierly ranks on one half of the desk, and the other half was bare, waiting for him to begin work. 9 model airplanes filled a display case, and 3 others hung on wires from the ceiling. The walls were decorated with evenly spaced posters, 3 baseball stars, 5 hideous monsters from horror movies, that Danny had carefully arranged. Unlike many boys his age, he'd been concerned about orderliness and cleanliness. Respecting his preference for neatness, Tina had instructed Mrs. Nettler, the cleaning lady who came in twice a week, to vacuum and dust his unused bedroom as if nothing had happened to him. The place was as spotless as ever. Gazing at the dead boy's toys and pathetic treasures, Tina realized, not for the first time, that it wasn't healthy for her to maintain this place as if it were a museum or a shrine. As long as she left his things undisturbed, she could continue to entertain the hope that Danny was not dead, that he was just away somewhere for a while, and that he would shortly pick up his life where he had left off. Her inability to clean out his room suddenly frightened her. For the first time it seemed like more than just a weakness of spirit but an indication of serious mental illness. She had to let the dead rest in peace. If she was ever to stop dreaming about the boy, if she were to get control of her grief, she must begin her recovery here, in this room, by conquering her irrational need to preserve his possessions in situ. She resolved to clean this place out on Thursday, New Year's Day. Both the VIP premiere and the opening night of Magic would be behind her by then. She'd be able to relax and take a few days off. She would start by spending Thursday afternoon here, boxing the clothes and toys and posters. As soon as she made that decision, most of her nervous energy dissipated. She sagged, limp and weary and ready to return to bed. As she started toward the door, she caught sight of the easel, stopped, and turned. Danny had liked to draw, and the easel, complete with a box of pencils and pens and paints, had been a birthday gift when he was 9. It was an easel on one side and a chalkboard on the other. Danny had left it at the far end of the room, beyond the bed, against the wall, and that was where it had stood the last time that Tina had been here. But now it lay at an angle, the base against the wall, the easel itself slanted, chalkboard down, across a game table. An electronic battleship game had stood on that table, as Danny had left it, ready for play, but the easel had toppled into it and knocked it to the floor. Apparently, that was the noise she had heard. But she couldn't imagine what had knocked the easel over. It couldn't have fallen by itself. She put her gun down, went around the foot of the bed, and stood the easel on its legs, as it belonged. She stooped, retrieved the pieces of the electronic battleship game, and returned them to the table. When she picked up the scattered sticks of chalk and the felt eraser, turning again to the chalkboard, she realized that 2 words were crudely printed on the black surface. Not dead. She scowled at the message. She was positive that nothing had been written on the board when Danny had gone away on that scouting trip. And it had been blank the last time she'd been in this room. belatedly, as she pressed her fingertips to the words on the chalkboard. The possible meaning of them struck her. As a sponge soaked up water, she took a chill from the surface of the slate. Not dead. It was a denial of Danny's death. An angry refusal to accept the awful truth. A challenge to reality. In one of her terrible seizures of grief, in a moment of crazy dark despair, had she come into this room and unknowingly printed those words on Danny's chalkboard? She didn't remember doing it. If she had left this message, she must be having blackouts, temporary amnesia of which she was totally unaware. Or she was walking in her sleep. Either possibility was unacceptable. Dear God, unthinkable. Therefore, the words must have been here all along. Danny must have left them before he died. His printing was neat, like everything else about him, not sloppy like this scrawled message. Nevertheless, he must have done it. Must have. And the obvious reference that those two words made to the bus accident in which he had perished? Coincidence. Danny, of course, had been writing about something else, and the dark interpretation that could be drawn from those two words now, after his death, was just a macabre coincidence. She refused to consider any other possibility because the alternatives were too frightening. She hugged herself. Her hands were icy, they chilled her sides even through her nightgown. Shivering, she thoroughly erased the words on the chalkboard, retrieved her handgun, and left the room, pulling the door shut behind her. She was wide awake, but she had to get some sleep. There was so much to do in the morning. Big day. In the kitchen, she withdrew a bottle of wild turkey from the cupboard by the sink. It was Michael's favorite bourbon. She poured 2 ounces into a water glass. Although she wasn't much of a drinker, indulging in nothing more than a glass of wine now and then, with no capacity whatsoever for hard liquor, she finished the bourbon in 2 swallows. Grimacing at the bitterness of the spirits, wondering why Michael had extolled this brand's smoothness, she hesitated, then poured another ounce. She finished it quickly, as though she were a child taking medicine, and then put the bottle away. In bed, again she snuggled in the covers and closed her eyes and tried not to think about the chalkboard. But an image of it appeared behind her eyes. When she couldn't banish that image, she attempted to alter it, mentally wiping the words away. But in her mind's eye, the 7 letters reappeared on the chalkboard, not dead. Although she repeatedly erased them, they stubbornly returned. She grew dizzy from the bourbon and finally slipped into welcome oblivion.